welcome to the first VFF Keeping Connected videos. In this series, we're featuring leaders of government and industry talking about industry matters that affect farmers and their rural communities. Today, I'm joined by Shadow Minister of Agriculture and leader of the Nationals Party, Peter Walsh. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, David. Pleasure to be part of the program.
Fantastic. All right, we'll get straight into it. As you know, there's a lot going on both in agriculture and in the community at the moment, and nothing's bigger than what's happening around COVID. How do you see the border restrictions affecting Victorian agriculture and the rural communities that they live within?
Well, it's a huge issue, as everyone knows, and it varies from farm to farm, commodity to commodity, but it has affected the whole spectrum of agriculture, whether it be the border with New South Wales or the border with South Australia. Just farmers getting to farms that they own on the other side of the border, contractors getting across to the other side. The issue around with upcoming harvest, how are they going to get the headers and the hay machinery up into northern New South Wales to start the season if they don't free this up? We've got people who have been trying to get the special exemption to go up there. At this stage, no one can tell them how to actually do that. So I think the announcement by the New South Wales Deputy Premier in Albury on Tuesday to widen the bubble along the border is a start, but there's a lot more needs to be done, David. And I went over there and was actually with John Barilaro and reinforced the issues for the whole of the communities, but particularly around agriculture and how Victorians get further than a 50k from the river into New South Wales to do the things that they're going to need. They're looking at a good harvest this year, and they will need every bit of machinery and every bit of manpower they can up there to get that off. Let alone the issue around shearers. Had an issue, group of shearers came back from up near Hay because of wet weather, and then couldn't get back. Didn't bring their gear home with them. Why would you put that in the boot when you're just coming home? Couldn't even get back to get their gear. So, it's just ridiculous things. And I think to have someone in Sydney tell a farmer they have to put their sheep on an aeroplane to go to Sydney to get into New South Wales, or when they told Chris Taylor from Warwick to be he had to put his hay on the aeroplane, the fact that someone actually even says that should have sent alarm bells in the New South Wales Premier's office that this is just crazy.
And you said you met with John Barilaro, Deputy Premier of New South Wales. How receptive was he with the issues facing Victoria? Because we also understand that there's New South Wales farmers facing similar problems as well.
Well, there is. It's not just Victorians going across the border. It's South Australians coming into Victoria or New South Welshmen coming into Victoria. So I don't think there is a comprehension in Melbourne and Sydney about how cross-border communities work. In New South Wales, Victoria's case, the fact there's a river down the middle of a lot of these communities only means effectively there's different colour number plates. Apart from that, everyone just goes about their business as per normal until COVID. So I don't think there's a good understanding. I think, to the credit of the Deputy Premier of New South Wales, he actually was in Albury-Wodonga, I think it was the Thursday before we met on Tuesday, and effectively had half-hour back-to-back meetings all day from stakeholder groups, from local government, around what the issues were. He went back and he was fresh out of a phone hook up with the New South Wales Premier before he did his press conference on Tuesday about extending the bubble out to 50k, and that's the principle behind that is to normalise life for people 50k each side of the border. But as I've said a number of times, repeat now with you, David, that's just a first step. There's a lot more that needs to be done. This goes back to one of my pet things for years is we need to decentralise the decision making into our communities more, to have the decision makers based in the capital cities where they have no comprehension of what our life is like. It means we get these crazy sorts of decisions. So let's decentralise some of the power. Let's get the decision makers actually living in our communities so they understand the impact their decisions are having on those communities.
Oh, absolutely. And what we've heard is the National Cabinet has agreed to develop a national code for agricultural workers. Look, this is probably, if it can get into fruition, it should help some areas, but there's still going to be problems facing those communities. What else needs to change on this front to make it all workable?
Well, I suppose the very first thing would be if Victoria hadn't had a blowout in the numbers. If hotel quarantine had worked, if contact tracing had actually worked, we wouldn't be in this situation. So that was a failure, and that's why the other states are doing what they're doing. to make that work better. First thing is Victoria needs to get its numbers under control. That would make a huge impact on the argument from the other states. And lines on maps are always a challenge, David, and you know this from your years now, that whether it be drought, whether it be flood, whether it be COVID, when you put a line on a map, there is always someone just outside that line that is equally as deserving of whatever it is that the people inside the line have. So although the 50K is a lot better step forward than the 2K zone, somehow we need to open up effectively all of regional Victoria. If in an ideal world, if you could just put a fence around Melbourne, it would solve a lot of the issues. But as you know, we as Victorians need two-way traffic in Melbourne to get the things we need out of Melbourne as well. So it's how you get confidence that Victoria is doing the right thing for the other states, and then extend that zone further and further south from the New South Wales border, or further and further east from the South Australian border.
And it's definitely highlighted some challenges, I guess, both in travel and also movement of goods with COVID and the restrictions, both domestically but also internationally. And trade's become one of the other hot topics that's on the back of the current situations. And with respect to the decisions of the Chinese government to restrict some of the markets, including barley, wine and beef, what should the government be focusing on to assist agriculture?
Well, I suppose over time we've become too dependent on China for our markets. I think they are a very profitable market for whatever the commodity you mentioned was. But as you know from your own personal business, you need to diversify your risk. And I think, unfortunately, we've now been found out that we've become over dependent on China. They're not silly. They're great traders. They know that if they build up demand, they build up people's reliance on that demand, and then they've got you. So there is going to be some tough negotiations over the next year or two with China, and I think we have to be behind our federal government and make sure those tough negotiations are had, because if we just effectively roll over every time, we'll find ourselves in a worse situation sometime down the track. So key thing I think is investment from both federal and state government into developing markets other than China, developing supply chains for the critical things we need other than China. I think that the COVID crisis has shown up some weaknesses in our supply chains, both from an export point of view and particularly from the import point of view. That, a very simple issue, you wouldn't have thought that face masks would have been in short supply until this happened, and our reliance on overseas production of face masks. So that's been resolved with some local manufacturing now. Pharmaceuticals, again, either come from China or India. We need to make sure for all those things we need in everyday life that we actually have some reliance here in Australia. And the same goes with agricultural chemicals and some of the things there. I think the discussion that's been had about building up a strategic supply of fuel is an important one. Our fuel supply is not very, the number of days fuel supply we have in Australia is not very long. If there was a major interruption to diesel and petrol in the middle of harvest, we'd have a major issue. So I think the federal government has started that, to build a strategic supply of fuel, but we need to take that to the next level as well and make sure that strategic supply is actually in Australia rather than necessarily held offshore.
Do you think that consumers are a bit more aware of their food and what's the supply chain actually like because of the COVID situation and because we have been highlighting things such as our trading partners?
Well, I think, tragically with the COVID pandemic, we've seen the loss of lives, the loss of jobs, the loss of businesses, which is just tragic for everyone that's been impacted. But it also opens our eyes to some of those things we've just talked about and the need to support local community businesses and Australian businesses. So I think it will reignite a discussion around how we actually, what we in Victoria are terming bringing manufacturing home. How do we actually get the next generation of jobs and the next generation of manufacturing back into Australia to reduce that reliance on overseas? It's not about starting a car industry again, but there's a lot of new generation manufacturing, high tech, good quality jobs that we could develop in Australia on the back of this, because people have a focus on reducing that reliance on imports.
And what we've heard is that the recovery, or people who are now facing these challenges, is definitely a trying time, but even more so in the agricultural area where we've seen people who are recovering from bushfires. And it's almost been that double impact, double whack that they've had to try to not only get themselves back on their feet, but get a community active again after already having one tragedy and on top of now a second one. How do you think that they're travelling and at the moment after they've essentially had probably one of the worst years ever in 2020?
Well, I think if you're particularly talking East Gippsland, David, they've had the trifecta that they were having a drought before the bushfires and a lot of publicity around that. And I know the VFF did a lot of work with getting hay down there during the drought, and then it rolled into bushfires, and then it's rolled into COVID. So particularly Gippsland and northeast Victoria. Northeast had the bushfires and now COVID. When I was in Albury with John Barilaro on Tuesday, talking to Bill Tilley, the local member, he said Corryong up through the fire area up there, the community is still suffering lack of employment opportunities. And I think one of the challenges has been through this is with the shutting down of schools and the disengagement of a lot of students. There's a lot of post bushfires and now COVID. There's a lot of students who've actually dropped out of the system. We're going to almost lose a generation to education if we're not careful in some of these communities.
And I guess one of the other things that is obviously always on farmers' mind is the weather and how the season's tracking. How is your feeling for both what the season's been like so far and also what the prospects are in the back end of the year? It's always a bit hard to, as a farmer, to peg this, but it's always good to ask some ministerial guidance of where do you see it landing?
Well, if we knew the answer to what the weather was going to do, we both probably wouldn't be on this call. We'd be doing something that made us a lot more money. But in general, and obviously with COVID, I'm not travelling as much around the state as I normally would, but what travelling I have done, I think crops in a lot of areas are looking good. The recent rain was very timely, particularly for the northwest. I haven't had the opportunity to get back to the Miller since the crops were sown, but I hope that they're going all right up there because they've had a really tough time over the last few years. I think the disappointing thing is that the prices for a lot of things have come down. That the COVID, the interruption to our overseas markets, the interruption to our domestic markets, like not having food service, not having restaurants, takes away a lot of those high value products that aren't in demand like they were. The value add for a steak at a restaurant compared to buying a steak in the supermarket, there's some, it has collapsed the prices and the demand. So, very unfortunate. It's tough in farming, as you know, to have a good season and good prices. And tragically, the prices for a lot of commodities have come down significantly.
That is the greatest challenge. It's working with the weather and then doing the best using the art and skill of farming to do what you can to turn into product. But Peter, I'd like to thank you very much for being a participant in the first VFF Keeping Connected series. I wish you, I hope all farmers have a fantastic season for the back end of it and that we do get through these challenges together. So Peter Walsh, Shadow Minister of Agriculture, Leader of the National Party, thank you very much for being a part of this.
Thanks, David. Thanks. Pleasure.